Hey there, it's me, Josh. Welcome back to Story Time. Get comfortable, get ready. Hope you're excited. We're going to be reading Mr. Muddle by Roger Hargreaves. Let's just delve straight into it, eh? I wonder what Mr. Muddle's about. What do you think? All good ideas. All right, here we go. We're about to delve into Story Time. Let's go. Poor Mr. Muddle just couldn't get anything right. Oh, okay, so he's a little bit muddled, is what Mr. Muddle is about. Everything he did, everything he tried, everything he said was muddled. Totally, utterly, completely, absolutely muddled. Here he is with his red hat on. He's got his shoes on his feet. His shoes on his hands. I'm used to saying shoes on feet. That's the right way to do it, shoes on hands. And I actually just noticed on the front cover, look, he's like turned around, walking backwards, all muddled. Mr. Muddle is really quite muddled, hey? Imagine, for instance, something as simple as hammering a nail into a wall. Now, what could get muddled with hammering a nail into a wall? Mr. Muddle could get it muddled, and frequently did. So, he's got the hammer backwards here and he's about to nail onto the sharp end of the nail. Hammer onto the sharp end of the nail, I'm sorry. Good on you, Mr. Muddle. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as putting on your coat. Now, what could get muddled with putting on your coat? Well, see for yourself. Only Mr. Muddle would put his coat on like that. Sometimes it's actually fun putting your coat on backwards, but not when you need to put it on normally. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as going for a walk. Now, what could get muddled with going for a walk? Well, when your legs start walking one day and you start walking the other, when your legs start walking one way and you start walking the other, that's a very muddly sort of walk. Sorry, that confused me because it is very muddly. I got muddled. Oh. Poor Mr. Muddle, walking one way and going another. Look what we were saying on the front of the book earlier. Walking one way but going another. Wow. Now you'd probably like to know where Mr. Muddle lives. In a house by the sea near a place called Seatown. Mr. Muddle's house was supposed to be in the country, but Mr. Muddle, who built the house himself, had got the place muddled up. Of course. And you can tell that Mr. Muddle had built the house himself. You can tell, can't you? This story starts one afternoon when Mr. Muddle was having breakfast. Yes, we know you don't have breakfast in the afternoon, but you do if your mealtime's muddled up. Mr. Muddle was having bread and butter and jam and a cup of tea with milk and sugar. Let's see how he handles this. He spread the butter on the table, and then spread the jam on the plate, and then poured the milk on the bread, and then filled the cup with sugar, and then poured the tea on the bread. What a terribly muddly mixed up breakfast. That afternoon after breakfast, he went for a walk down the beach near his house in order to work up an appetite for supper. He met an old fisherman called George, whom he knew quite well. "Good afternoon, Mr. Muddle," said George. "Good evening," replied Mr. Muddle. George smiled. "How would you like to come fishing with me?" he asked. "Oh, no, please," replied Mr. Muddle eagerly. No, please. "Help me push the boat out from the beach," called George. "Righto," said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat further up on the beach. "Oh, Mr. Muddle," said George, and he had to show Mr. Muddle the difference between pulling and pushing. So the boat needs to go into the water and he's pulled it further up the beach. However, eventually, somehow or other, they managed to get the boat out to sea. There they are, they're out on the ocean, going fishing. Uh-oh, looks like Mr. Muddle's ended up in the water already. Now let's fish, said George, dropping a fishing line over the side of the boat. Righto, said Mr. Muddle, and dropped himself over the side of the boat. Splash! Oh, Mr. Muddle, said George again. It wasn't any good, and they didn't catch any fish, so they decided to go home before it became dark. Help me pull the boat up on the beach. Onto the beach, called George. Righto, said Mr. Muddle. Muddle, I'm sorry. I'm mixing them up because he says ritho instead of righto. So muddled. It's actually confusing to read. That's what's so cool about it. George was just about to say, "Oh, Mr. Muddle again," when he had an idea. He smiled to himself. Help me push the boat out into the sea, George called. Righto, said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat up onto the beach. Well done, Mr. Muddle, said George. Mr. Muddle smiled a smile and went home. George smiled a smile and went to tell everybody. The following day in Seatown, Mr. Brick the Builder asked Mr. Muddle to hold his coat for him. Righto, said Mr. Muddle. He held his ladder for him, which is what Mr. Brick really wanted. Well done, Mr. Muddle, smiled Mr. Brick, who had been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was very pleased. So they're telling him things muddled, that way he does it normal, kind of thing. If that makes sense. So I guess the fisherman has informed everybody in the town so that Mr. Muddle isn't always so muddled around them. That's cool. Teamwork makes the dream work. Then Mrs. Scrub at the laundry asked Mr. Muddle to pass her the soap. Righto, said Mr. Muddle, and passed her a clothes peg, which is what Mrs. Scrub really wanted. Well done, Mr. Muddle, smiled Mrs. Scrub, who'd also been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was extremely pleased. And then Mr. Black, the coalman, asked Mr. Muddle to lift a sack of coal down from his lorry. Righto, said Mr. Muddle, and lifted a sack of coal up onto the lorry, which is what Mr. Black had wanted all along. Well done, Mr. Muddle, smiled Mr. Black. George had talked to everybody. Mr. Muddle was delighted. Look at helping him out there. Now, when he helps people, he's not helping them muddled. In fact, Mr. Muddle was so delighted he decided to go home and cook himself a large meal to celebrate. Roast turkey and peas and potatoes and gravy. Yum. He put the turkey in the cupboard to cook, he peeled the peas, he put the potatoes in the refrigerator to boil. And then do you know what he did? He tried to slice the gravy. Oh, Mr. Muddle. There we go. A muddly fun book. Hope you enjoyed that story today. I'll be back again with another really soon. So stick around, and also stick around for the little misses as well that we're going to get into also. Please subscribe, click that bell below if you like reading these stories. Bye for now, but not forever.